And also, you want to come by in at the end of October. Tony and Landon will be here to talk all about the 30-knot gourmet. When you go sailing, usually we end up with, in ocean races, tough fare, freeze-dried food sometimes, and we end up putting all of our stuff into a small bag this big because we're worried about weight. These guys are going to talk about how you can eat an incredibly light fare, but have incredibly good gourmet food. So 30-knot gourmet, these are authorities on great cooking while you're sailing in the ocean and racing in the ocean. We have seen little submarines around here. They're growing in popularity, and they're becoming a feature in really high-end tourist resorts. And so Adam Wright will be here to talk all about deep flight submarines. These are small 1- and 2-person subs, and I've been in a 2-person sub, and first of all, it's like being inside of a birdcage Maserati. It's like really tight, barely fit inside it. But these are incredible. They go down, great depths, and they're incredibly cool rides. So Adam will be here to talk all about that. We keep looking out the window at the bay, but we forget about what's happening under the bay and the ocean. We'll hear a lot about that from our speaker today. But on October 3rd, Dave McGuire will be here to talk all about sharks. He created shark stewards, and sharks are in danger. People are cutting the fins off of them, and people are taking them for granted and thinking that they're so plentiful we don't have to worry about them. Wrong. So come and listen to Dave talk to us all about sharks. And now, speaking about underwater, a little bit about our speaker today. It's always fascinating to think about the beginnings of a profession and a professional who's going to basically dedicate their life to making the water and the oceans better for the rest of us. At age 6, our speaker today first remembers being on a power boat, a boat of any kind. It was a little fishing boat, motorboat the family had in a little lake in Wisconsin. And, he was like 4 years old running around inside the boat and said to himself, way back at age 4, I want to be a marine biologist. At age 6, he could remember first fishing, but before that, he remembers he wanted to be a marine biologist. He basically had this dream in his head, but didn't actually see the ocean until age 17 when he went to Hilton Head and was overwhelmed by looking at the ocean. Couldn't believe that this was going to be, something he could have a profession around. And so at age 18, he went down to St. Croix in the Virgin in BVI's, and he took his first dive and was again overwhelmed by the color and the texture everywhere, and it was omnipresent. It was everywhere. He actually lost his balance and started sliding down a rock under the ocean and didn't know which way was up anymore. The colors were so vivid and bright around him. The dive master grabbed him, and of course he stuck it out and kept diving and diving and diving and became himself a dive master then, and then dedicated himself to a world paying attention to the oceans, went back to Wisconsin, got his undergraduate degree, went to Oregon, got his PhD, and became, of course, an important person in his business in the Coral Reef Foundation, which we'll hear all about today. But people who pay attention to the environment don't do so without the great and gracious help of other organizations and associates that they bring around them. And we want to thank NOAA and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and the Nature Conservancy and individuals, some of whom are in this room, who have supported his organization over the years. Our own member, Medea Byrne, was on the board of this organization, and also Jim Lucier. Jim Lucier is a current board member and a great supporter of the organization, and he's brought some colleagues to be here today to listen to what our speaker has to say. And so we take for granted the water that we sail on. If it wasn't for speakers like our speaker today, it wouldn't be here for us always, and we have to basically help them. We have to support them ourselves. So we're going to listen to what they have to say, but we're helping them speak at other yacht clubs around the Bay Area. And really, we in the aquatic environment, we need to form kind of networks around these organizations and help support them with our funds and with other things that we can provide to them. Because if it wasn't for speakers like those that we have today, we would not be able to keep enjoying the beautiful ocean and bay that we do. So please welcome our own speaker today, Michael Webster. Michael, thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. It's hard to imagine a much better setting to talk about the ocean than sitting here right next to the bay, and a much better audience than people who live around and love the oceans. I'm going to be talking about coral reefs today, and I just wanted to get a show of hands. How many people have been on or around coral reefs in this audience? All right, so a lot of you. Good, that helps. These videos in the background on the slides right now are just giving you a little sense of what a coral reef looks like. This is a place that's very near and dear to my heart. And I want to just begin by telling you a little bit about the outline of the talk that I'm going to give to you today. And I'm really going to try and make 4 points. The first is that coral reefs are in a situation where they really need to be saved. There's a lot going on in coral reefs, and there's a lot of problems, and we'll talk about those. The second point that I want to make is that there's a lot at stake in whether and how we get this right. I think that there are some really good reasons to be optimistic about coral reefs for the future, and that's what I'm really going to focus on today. Why should we be optimistic about this? And one of the things that makes us especially optimistic is that we're starting to build a plan for how to save coral reefs, and we think we've got some pretty good answers for what this can look like. And that's a real shift in our field from pessimism to optimism, and we're excited to figure out how to get this done, and we're excited to find as many people who can help us get that done as possible. All right, anybody seen an article recently in the newspaper or on TV about coral reefs? If you did, it probably wasn't very good news. Articles like this have been really, really common in the last few years, with titles like, "The Great Barrier Coral Reef is Dying Faster Than Ever." These kinds of articles are out there because scientists and other people who care about reefs are observing that they are changing really, really quickly, and oftentimes in ways that people don't like very much. There are reasons to think coral reefs are dying and coral reefs are in trouble. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is, but I wanted to just begin by giving you a sense of what this looks like. What does it mean for a coral reef to die? So this is a picture of a coral reef in Discovery Bay, Jamaica in 1978. It's an interesting picture because it was a picture that was taken for a research group that was studying the reef. They wanted to understand the corals and how they changed over time. And so they did this thing where they got into this system and they wanted to go back to the same place year after year and measure what was there and look at how it changed. And so they did this thing where can we see the mouse here? Yeah, perfect. They drilled a hole in a coral head and they put a stainless steel pin in that hole. So they could come back year after year and they could put this big PVC quadrat on top of the reef and they could look in it and they could count what was there. And the pin was important because they could get back to exactly the same place. Now, Discovery Bay has changed a lot since 1978, and I'm going to show you a picture in a moment of this exact same reef in the year 2011. And you'll know it's the exact same reef because you're going to see that stainless steel pin. No quadrat, but look for the pin. All right, are you ready? See the pin? See if I can get the mouse to work. The pin's right in the same place it was in the previous slide. So it went from this live, growing coral, building structure, places for fish to live, providing a wonderful coral reef habitat, to something that looks like this. This is not a minor change. This is not a few species that are less abundant. This is a wholesale transformation of an ecosystem. And the reason that people are sounding the alarm is that they're seeing this happen in more and more and more places around the world. For me, the moment that I realized that this was a really big deal and we needed to do something about it was when I was actually getting my PhD. As Ron had mentioned, I wanted to be a marine biologist since I was 4. When I was a student, I decided to work on coral reefs and study them for my PhD, and I studied these funny little purple and yellow fish that you see on this overhead environment here in the Caribbean. I was mostly interested in the fish. They were colorful, they had interesting behavior. I wanted to understand how they worked. I wanted to understand everything that was about them. So I dedicated myself to studying them and working in these ecosystems. But in the middle of my PhD work, something happened. One summer that we were out working in the Bahamas, the water got unusually warm. It was so warm that on a hot Bahamian day when the temperatures would be in the upper 90s and you'd be dying because you were so hot, jumping in the water to cool off no longer worked. Jumped in the water and it was just hot and uncomfortable and terrible. And at that same time, something started to happen to all the corals. They started to lose their color and turn white, like the one you see here on the slide. This is called coral bleaching. It had been seen before, but we were not in any way prepared for what was going to happen that summer. Corals everywhere on all of the reefs throughout the Bahamas started to bleach, and they started to die. And by the next year, a huge fraction, we weren't counting, we were counting the fish, but half the corals or more disappeared from these reefs. That was a real wake-up call for me, and it was a real shift in my thinking from, wouldn't it be interesting to study how these systems work, to a different question of, how do we begin to do something for these systems that are clearly in trouble? So I mentioned that my focus in research was on fish. But what I realized was that these corals that were on the reef probably deserved a little bit more attention. So I began to pay a little bit more attention to them when this bleaching event happened. And it turns out that while the corals aren't swimming around like the fish are, they're actually doing some pretty miraculous things. This is a little loop video that shows you some corals close up. A lot of people don't even know what corals are. They think of them as these like slimy rocks on the bottom of the ocean. It turns out that they're animals. They're not what we usually think of as animals, but they're animals. And you can see here, each of these little things that looks like a flower, or maybe a little anemone, that's a coral polyp. And that's an individual coral organism. Now, corals grow often in colonies where there are many of these polyps together. And you can see there's a few hundred of them in this image. Most of these polyps are really pretty small, so unless you look closely, you won't necessarily see them individually. But these polyps can grow and cover areas of the reef, and they've figured out some things evolutionarily that are just amazing. One of the coolest they've figured out is how to make food for themselves in a place that has very low nutrient in it. If you've been to a coral reef, you've probably noticed the water is clear, you can see really far. It's very different from the water out here in the bay. It has very different nutrients in it. It has very different available food for organisms. Coral reefs are kind of ocean deserts. And one of the cool things that corals have figured out in that ocean desert is how to recycle nutrients and turn them back into food. And they've done it by growing these little tiny plants inside their tissues. They're called in this slide here zooxanthellae. You can see right here. These are little miniature plants, little phytoplankton. Well, let's just call them plants because that's easier. Inside the coral, that the coral provides them a home, gives them a place to live, gives them a nice spot in the sun to grow. And they grow faster because the coral will give them their waste products, like their extra nitrogen and phosphorus. They feed it to the algae, the little plants. Little plants give the coral food. And it's an internal symbiosis. It's a beautiful thing to do in an ocean desert. And what it allows the corals to do is something that's really miraculous. It gives them a lot of energy in a place where energy is hard to come by. And they use some of that energy to build a rocky skeleton. So right here underneath this coral animal is you see that this white structure. That's built of, oops, let me just go back. That's built of calcium carbonate, and the coral does this by pulling calcium ions out of the water and pulling CO2 out of the water, breaking them together, fusing them, and making this calcium carbonate ion. They basically make it into rock, and they build a rocky skeleton, and they use that rocky skeleton to hold their place on the bottom, to overgrow their neighbors, and that's how they hold their space, and that's how the coral reef is actually built. If you go to a coral reef and you look around, what you see are these amazing structures, mounds and caves and arches and structures that look like trees. Those are being built by the corals over a very long period of time. And they're able to make that calcium carbonate rock, which becomes the reef itself. So when you're on a reef, you can see that. You can see the structures that the corals have made. Those structures are what make the home for all the life on the reef. But if you pan back and you look at a little bit larger scale, you begin to realize that what corals are doing is actually much larger than the structure you see on the reef. They can build whole islands, for example. This is an atoll in the Pacific. This island is entirely made of coral, and a few other organisms that can do the same kind of physiological trick on a coral reef. They're building islands. There are thousands of these islands around the world that are made of coral. If you pan back further, you can look at structures like this one. This is just a section of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. This entire reef, all this stuff offshore that if you guys are sailing out there, you would want to pay very close attention to, all of this stuff is built by corals. And all of that is predicated on this amazing ability to recycle nutrients internally and build these structures. So when somebody named a coral reef, they got it right. It really is about the corals. It's about the corals that are even making the reef and providing the habitat for everything else. So the problem that we're having on coral reefs all over the world is that the corals are dying and disappearing. And we have a pretty good idea of why. At the local scale, where people live near the reef, there are a number of things people do that cause harm to the reef. The two most common that we see over and over and over again, almost everywhere where people live near reefs around the world, is they do two things. One, they pollute the coastal water, particularly with things like nutrients, and they remove the fish from the system for economic purposes or for subsistence. Both of those things together change the environment from this ocean desert where corals are the dominant organism to a different kind of ecosystem where things like seaweeds can take over. Seaweeds do better at higher nutrients. And some of those fish that are on the reef keep the reef clean and they keep the space open for the corals. When the fish are gone and the nutrients come in, you get a shift in that ecosystem away from corals and towards seaweeds. Problem is, seaweeds don't build the reef. They don't build the structure and they don't provide the habitat. So that picture that I showed you in Jamaica is what begins to happen when you shift from a coral system to another system. It doesn't have the same value. The other problem that's happening on coral reefs is that the climate is changing and it's changing very quickly. This is a graph of temperature on Earth over the last 130 years or so. What you can see is that for the first part of this time series, these blue lines below are pointing to years that were colder than average. The black line is the average. Over the last 40, 50 years, we've been getting more and more red lines. The pattern, you don't have to be a statistician to see this pattern here. It's getting warmer and warmer and warmer. And it turns out that that coral bleaching that I showed you on that coral before, that's most often triggered by the water getting particularly warm. And the years when we've seen this happen around the world on a global scale have been first in 1983 and 1984. There was this big event around the world where corals started bleaching. Nobody had any idea what was going on. It was a totally new phenomenon that was being seen on the reef. In 1998, we had an enormous El Nino. That was the year I was working in the Bahamas. Reefs all around the world started bleaching again. This was the second time we saw this really on a global scale. And then it happened in 2010. And then it happened in 2015, 16, and 17. And what you see here is that this new phenomenon that was seen for the first time in the 80s is becoming really common. And everything tells us it's going to be more common as we move into the future. So coral reefs are in trouble. And if we lose coral reefs, we lose a lot. One of the things that people talk about when they talk about coral reefs, and one of the obvious observations you have if you've ever been on a coral reef, is there are a whole lot of different organisms on the reef. This photo just shows a few of them. There are different kinds of fish, different kinds of corals, different kinds of sponges, different kinds of tunicates, if you know what a tunicate is. There are all these crazy organisms, and everywhere you look, there's something different on the reef. It turns out that coral reefs are probably the most diverse place on the planet. They're most certainly the most diverse place in the ocean. And if you just bear with me for a second and think about this, you guys know a lot about the oceans. The oceans are gigantic. Coral reefs cover a tiny fraction of 1% of the world's oceans. They're just a little tiny sliver of all of the ocean around the world. And yet in that tiny sliver, they hold a quarter, 25% of all the species in the ocean. These species are jam-packed into coral reefs because coral reefs provide such an amazing, complex environment for so many species to thrive. And all of those species are dependent on the coral reef to continue to be healthy and provide a home for them. There are also people who depend on the coral reef. This boy lives in a village in coastal Honduras, and his community is a community of fishers, and they depend on the coastal environment for their food as well as for their economic opportunity, and he is going to be depending on the coral reef for his future. It turns out that he's not alone. He's one of some 400 million people around the world who depend on the coral reef for their livelihoods. Some of them depend on it because it helps generate economic opportunity through tourism. Some of them are involved in fisheries, like that boy in Honduras. Some of them live in places that without the coral reef, waves are going to overtake their islands and their homes during storms and during flood events. And all of us have a stake in this because coral reefs increasingly are looking like the medicine chest of the future. There are tons and tons of new medicines in development coming off of coral reefs, everything from cancer drugs to antivirals to painkillers, even to a new class of sunscreens coming off of coral reefs. If we want to have access to those medicines in the future, we need to be able to have the organisms on the reef from which we're finding those biological molecules to build our medicines on. So what's happening on coral reefs, sure, it's pretty bad, and there's a lot at stake. I want to shift now and begin telling you why I'm optimistic, why I think that we should really be thinking about a positive future for coral reefs. And I begin with this particular slide because this reef just happens to be the reef that sits off a shore where that boy in Honduras lives. This is the reef in front of his home. And it's, frankly, a really weird reef. And if we didn't know it was there, we wouldn't predict it was there. It's in a place where a bunch of big rivers flow off of the mainland into the ocean, and it's pretty polluted. It's also pretty overfished by communities like that one. And what we know from most places is that those conditions tend not to be great conditions for coral reefs. And yet, if you go into the water here, you find this ridiculously beautiful coral reef with higher coral cover than just about any place in the entire Caribbean. Why? I honestly don't know. I've got a guess. I think that maybe this place has always been a harsh environment, and these particular corals have spent millions of years adapting to and learning how to survive in what would normally be a harsh environment. Those rivers have been there for a long time. If that's true, what it suggests is that maybe these particular corals in this particular place hold some of the key for the future of coral reefs. Maybe they're special. Maybe they've got traits that's going to allow them to survive in a world that's changing. Well, the more we look for weird, special corals like this, the more we find them. Here are just a few. This coral lives in a place with ridiculously high wave forces that would shatter just about any other coral. It's figured out how to live in places that are incredibly stormy and wavy. This one lives at the outflow of a petroleum refinery. Seriously. This is one of the most polluted reefs I've ever been to before, and it's got these amazing brain corals all over it. The one in the lower left is on a reef that's in a full-on bleaching event. And for some reason, this one here didn't bleach. It's got some characteristic that makes it fine with the temperature that's bleaching all the other corals around it. And then this one right here, this one has grown in the last 2 years since this reef got absolutely shattered by a Category 5 cyclone. All these reefs are doing something special, or all these corals are doing something special. They're doing something different. They're doing something that's unexpected. And the more we look, the more unexpected things we're finding with all these corals. And that alone makes me optimistic. While we're losing a lot of coral around the world, there are a lot of corals that seem to be able to deal with the changes that are coming. All right, a little more coral biology. Anybody know what's going on in this little video? This is coral spawning. So corals are animals, and when they want to reproduce sexually, they have to figure out a way to get eggs and sperm together. Now, they're in a colony of clones, and it's not a good idea to breed with clones because that's how you get inbreeding, and that's a bad thing genetically. So corals have to figure out how to get their eggs and sperm connected to animals that are glued to the bottom on a rocky skeleton some ways away from them. And what they figured out how to do is, well, just dump your eggs and your sperm into the water column and let the currents do the work for you. The eggs and sperm of the right species can come together as the currents move around and form a little baby coral. And what you see in this video are the eggs coming out of a coral up into the water column. Now, corals across a reef time it so they all do this at the same time so they can all get their gametes in the water at the same time. The cool part of this is that when that happens, the baby coral floats. It doesn't start as an animal that's glued to the bottom. It starts as an animal that floats. And it might float for a few days, it might float for a few weeks, it might even float for a few months. And what that means is that if you've got a special coral like those ones in Honduras, and it spawns and makes babies, those babies can travel. And they can travel and they can seed other reefs. Now I'm going to show you a video in just a second of what this looks like. The video is done by researchers in the Caribbean, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to look at how corals move after a spawning event like this. Where do these things go? Where do the currents take them? And so they modeled this for the whole Caribbean. And what you're going to see in this video is you're going to first see a bunch of red appear, and that red are the baby corals, and then you're going to see the currents move them around from place to place. And I'm going to focus your attention, if you will, on those reefs in Honduras, those weird reefs, because I want you to see where their babies might go. This is just one spawning event. It's not always going to work the same way. This is one run. All right, let's take a look. These are the people who put it together. All right, let's see if I can get my mouse here. Here's coastal Honduras. These are the baby corals from the weird reefs. So they've gone past these reefs in Honduras. They're going northward in this area off of the Yucatan, and now they're getting pushed to this coastline. And what you see is they get pushed all along this coastline, this whole coastline of the Yucatan and Mexico and Belize, a huge area. And so in this just one spawning event, over the course of about a month, these baby corals that originated here can spread to all of these reefs. So if there's something special about them, they can get around, and their babies, which are going to have some of the same traits as their parents, are going to spread throughout this system. That's a really good reason to be optimistic, because if there are special corals out there and we can find them, those special corals can populate reefs after they get disturbed. All right, the next reason that I'm super optimistic about the future coral reefs is that people can do a lot to make coral reefs better places. This is a community in Fiji. The community is called Kumbalau. And this community has a different history of property rights than we're accustomed to in the United States. Communities in Fiji own their coastal resources. They own the reef. This community happens to own one of the coolest reefs in the world called Nemena. This is an aerial photo of just the tip of Nemena. And this big ribbon right here out in the water, this is all coral reef. It's a huge area that extends off the coast of the island where these people live. And they noticed over time that this reef was in decline. It was particularly in decline because people were overfishing it. Too many people trying to take too many fish. And they decided they wanted to do something about it. And so we helped them design a system to try and manage this reef differently. They also noticed that people would come from all over the world to visit this reef, and they would spend huge amounts of money to go diving because the reef was so beautiful and so special. And so we helped them design a system whereby they would choose not to fish a portion of their reef, and in exchange for that, people who came to dive in that system would pay a small fee, it's like $15 for a year, to visit, and that fee would go to two things. One, it would go to the community, who would use it for community projects like scholarships for kids, and the other portion of it would go to the management of the reef, boats and fuel and keeping people on the water to make sure nobody was breaking the rules. We've been working with them on this for about a decade now, and it's largely self-sustaining. We've stepped away from it because it works. And it works, you can go in the water and see it. You go to this reef today, and what you're going to notice is that there's a lot of fish on the reef. Fish like this grouper, fish like the fish that keep the reef clean and help create a good environment for corals to grow, survive, and reproduce. So this is a wonderful success story, and this is what my organization does. We work with communities who are interested in managing their resource and thinking about how they can get a benefit from that resource, and we can get a benefit for the coral reef at the same time. And this is one example. So normally I would end the story here, except for in the last couple of years, something really big has happened in this system. This is Tropical Cyclone Winston, which in 2016 became the strongest storm ever recorded in the southern hemisphere. That eye of Winston went directly over Nemena. It didn't go well. This beach that you see on the left isn't really a beach. There's a close-up of it on the right. It is fragments of coral that have been shattered and aggregated into this beach structure that didn't exist there before. It gives you some notion of the magnitude of how this reef was scoured and torn to pieces in this storm. Just in May of this year, I was able to go to see this reef. So it'd been about 2 years from the storm. And what I was really interested to see was, well, how's it doing? We know it's got a well-managed fishery. We know it's pretty far offshore. It's got pretty clean water. Is it going to recover? Want to see it? This is Nemena in May. 2 years. Now, it's not perfect. You can look and say, well, there's some bare space right here. Nothing's living here. The fish and the corals are returning in a way that exceeds like my wildest hopes for a system like this. And what they show you is that if you manage this local system well, not only can you maintain it in a better state, but you can set it up to be able to recover after something like this happens. That makes me super optimistic. All right, the last part of the talk, and I'm going to get a little technical here, so bear with me. I want to talk about the plan that we're developing. and how people all over the world can help us get this done. First, I want to acknowledge that we are one organization working on coral reefs, and we've got tons of great partners doing tons of great work all over the world. Everywhere we work, we've got partners, and we've got partners all over the place in places we don't work. They're trying lots of different things on coral reefs. We're mostly focusing on these community management questions in the locations where we're active. We're also asking some big picture science questions about how we design this work for climate change. There are also groups who are doing things like this. This picture that you see right here shows a funny little coral in the middle of it. This baby coral was grown in a lab and transplanted out to the reef. And there's a lot of this work that's going on around restoration on reefs. It's a big topic in our field. It's complementary to what we're trying to get done. Okay, I'm going to try something experimental here. I'm going to leave coral reefs for just a minute, and I want to talk about an ear infection, because I think it's going to help us understand something we need to see on coral reefs. So if you have an ear infection, you start to get a fever, you start to have pain in your ear, and what's going on inside you biologically is that you've got a population of bacteria that's growing inside your body. So you could imagine that when that infection is raging around here, you've got a high bacterial count. Now, if you go to the doctor, you might get a prescription for antibiotics. And those antibiotics, if they're the right antibiotic for this particular infection, are designed to create a harsh environment inside your body for that bacteria so that its population declines over time. Goes down, and if you can get it all the way down to 0, then you're cured, and you can begin to totally recover. Now, when you get that prescription for antibiotics, the prescription is always really specific. Take every one of these pills. If you feel better, don't stop taking them. You have to make it to the end, because if you get down to here and you feel better and you haven't wiped out that infection, something else can happen. So if you haven't wiped it out when you stop taking the antibiotics, that population can come back and the infection can reemerge. And what will have happened to the bacteria during that window of time is that the bacteria that were strongest, the ones that were most able to deal with that particular antibiotic, those are the ones that survived. So now you've got an infection that's stronger than the one you had before because it's got some level of antibiotic resistance. This is why we keep cycling through different antibiotics around the world, because more and more antibiotics are becoming more and more resistant to different bacteria. In an evolutionary sense, this effect of antibiotic resistance is something called evolutionary rescue. And the idea of evolutionary rescue is that if a population suddenly finds itself in a harsh environment or a changed environment, its population is going to start to go down. If it happens to have the right genes, or say the right special corals, it has an opportunity to recover from that and actually come back stronger than it was before. And so if we shift this to corals, we actually want them to be rescued. We're not trying to get rid of them in the way that we would with an ear infection, although it seems like humanity is making a pretty good effort to do that. But when we look at the system and we see those special corals surviving bleaching events, surviving these big storms, coming back, what we're seeing is evolutionary rescue happening. And it's evolutionary rescue that's what's going to make a bright future for corals on coral reefs. We have to get through that phase of environmental change with enough of those animals that are special so that they can survive and come back. So I want to put a bunch of pieces together to go to the next part of the talk. The first is there's lots of special corals out there. Their babies can travel to new reefs. People can help corals recover through good management, and organisms can adapt to new environments. Those are the building blocks of a solution for coral reefs. At the core of this question of how is it going to happen is this inconvenient thing about, can corals do it fast enough? Bacteria grow very fast, they can evolve very quickly. Can corals evolve fast enough? So one of the things we've done as an organization is realize that this is actually one of the critical questions for our field. Can they do it fast enough? So we've gone to the scientific community, folks at places like Stanford, University of Washington, Rutgers, to help us answer the question of, can it go fast enough? The world is changing quickly. And the answer, we've looked at this a bunch of different ways, is always yes, if. And the if is about what we choose to do now. That it's actually within our hands. If we make the right actions today, corals can do this fast enough. So this is what it can look like. We know that that regions like this is the Mesoamerican region that we saw in that, that loop video before, Mexico and Belize and Honduras here. We know that in places like this, there are lots of reefs, and we can look across these regions and we can see people are trying to protect some of those reefs, and some reefs are different from each other. If we begin to think about those individual reefs as parts of a broader network, what we can do is we can get a lot of diversity in the system. We can have lots and lots of special corals, and we can begin to imagine how these special corals can move from one place to another, so that as a disturbance comes through this system, the whole system has the emergent property of coming back, like we saw in Nemena, and it can come back with special corals that are going to do better in the environmental conditions that can come. And so in principle, this all makes sense. It fits with biological and evolutionary theory. We have every reason to believe that this kind of system can work. What we've since started to do is say, okay, if we believe in theory it works, can we model it and use the best information we have about corals to actually design those systems to be the most successful possible? And so one thing you might do, and we hear a lot about this in our field, is how do you pick your individual reefs that you might put together in a network? One of the ways you might do it is you might say, oh, what are the best reefs that are out there? The prettiest reefs, the reefs with the most coral. Clearly, those are the best reefs. Those are the ones you want if you're building out a network, if you're building out a portfolio of reefs for adaptation. You could also say, no, there's some reefs out there that are naturally buffered from climate change. They're cooler than the other reefs, and we think they're going to stay cooler. Let's get those reefs. Those are the ones that are going to be doing the best in the future. There's another argument that says, wait, the reefs that are already warm already have the best adapted corals. We should be protecting the warmest reefs. All of these ideas sit out there. We've been asking the question, what about a mix? Maybe there's advantages to all those different strategies. Can you use a mathematical modeling context and what we understand about corals to actually design these systems to test? Well, let's imagine climate change is going to play out in this system. Do we see the adaptation that we want to see, and what designs work the best? Well, we've run a whole bunch of different scenarios. Here are 6 or 8 of them, including the ones we just talked about: hot reefs, cold reefs. You've got high coral cover reefs here. This one is just a random. This is a really diverse portfolio. And what you see is these ones on the top always perform the best. It's the ones that say, don't think you can pick the exact right reef. Get a mix. Get those weird reefs in Honduras that you don't even think are going to be there. Also get some of those really pristine reefs. Get some of those really warm reefs. Get some of those really cold reefs. And it's when you get the mix that you get a diverse portfolio of options. You've got a diverse portfolio of corals for the future, and you've got a diverse portfolio of different kinds of places for them to live. Then, within that interconnected system, that's where you start to get adaptation. And so we've used this to start thinking about a concept that we think is at the core of saving coral reefs, and that's the adaptive reefscape. The adaptive reefscape is a network of reefs that has a diverse portfolio of different kinds of reefs and different kinds of corals, and it's well connected, and we can use the mathematical modeling work we're doing to design it. How big should it be? How many reefs should be included? What kinds of reefs should be included? How far apart should they be? And all of those things are coming out of the work we're doing in order to allow us to design real-world networks in places like this, the Mesoamerican reef. And a lot of these are actually real places we're working, where we are working to build out this network of healthy reefs. We're doing this in the Mesoamerican region. That's this little tiny circle here in a world full of coral reefs. You see a bunch of different colors for different reefs around the world. That's great. By itself, it is not a solution to the issues facing coral reefs around the world. We think it can work in the Mesoamerican region, and that's great. We think it can be a demonstration for other places around the world. We as an organization, though, think we should be doing it in more than one place because we need to test out how we build it. How do we work with the communities? How do we work with the partners to get this to be a reality? And so we're working in 4 different regions around the world to provide the demonstration for how it works, to do some innovation around making it successful, and to provide that example for other organizations around the world. The good news is there are people working on coral reefs all over the place. And so one of our challenges going forward is to figure out how we take an idea like this, how we take the work we've done to figure out how to design these systems for adaptation and partner with a slew of organizations around the world who are involved in the same kind of work in coral reef region all over the planet, from Australia to the Seychelles to the Tuamotus to the Marshalls. There are coral reef regions everywhere, and there are partners throughout most of this system. So for us as an organization, our job right now is to figure out how to make this work in some specific regions like the Mesoamerican region, and to take this show on the road. How do we begin to work with partners at scientific institutions, at NGOs and governments to take this set of ideas and replicate this scalable solution for coral reefs all over the world? And I'm convinced we can do it. There are a lot of people out there trying to get this done. I think if we organize our work efficiently and effectively, we can do it. It's going to take a whole lot of building those local management systems, because those reefs like Nemena, they're the pieces that are going to make the whole system work. It's going to take a lot of work by an organization like ours to facilitate that local management. We've got lots of partners doing this as well. And getting the best science in place and getting those ideas out there. So this is something we are trying to do, and we are looking always for partners to help us get that done. It's going to be opportunities for any one of you in the room to do those sorts of things, but you can also support these communities directly by going there and visiting. If you're going to be traveling the tropics anyway, go to places that are doing a good job on their coral reefs and help support those local economies. And you can also make decisions for yourself about how you're affecting how this plays out around the world. That can be everything from your carbon footprint, which is helping to drive climate change, to how you behave when you're around a reef and not bumping into corals or watching your use of sunscreens. The reality is that if we're going to solve this for coral reefs, we need everybody. Everybody who's interested in this issue, everybody who wants to solve this issue, working in concert. Everyone from those people in that community in Cumberland to people like the people in this room, like our board members who are helping us get this done. But as I said at the beginning, I'm very optimistic. This is something we can do, and we're dedicating our organization to getting it done. Thank you.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from St. Francis Yacht Club. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Webster, Executive Director of the Coral Reef Alliance. Michael, Alliance, who's in the Alliance? How do they help you?
Everyone we can find. Do I have to turn this on?
No, should be on.
Okay. Everyone we can find.
Geo?
We're a partnership-based organization. All the work we do in places like Fiji or Honduras is built on the idea that communities, other NGOs, governments are part of the solution. And so we approach all our work around partnerships at the local scale. And we think that in order to achieve this global solution is going to be the same kind of work, partnerships with NGOs, governments, funders, scientists all around the world. And it's through partnership that we'll get to solutions that'll work.
So when was the Coral Reef Alliance founded? Who founded it?
It was founded in 1994 by a group of scuba divers who noticed that the coral reefs that they liked to visit were changing. They were in decline, and they decided to build an organization to try and help protect those coral reefs.
So now you mentioned that 1% of the ocean's floor is covered with coral reefs, and yet they represent 25% of the biodiversity in the ocean. Why are they so diverse?
There's a whole lot of people who have been asking that question scientifically for a long time. And while we don't know definitively, there's some really good ideas. One, species diversity tends to be more in the tropics. People think that's because the tropics are more stable over time and can accumulate more species. Another is that the coral reefs themselves are very complex. Lots of different kinds of structures, lots of different wave forces, lots of different microenvironments. The other is that coral reefs spread across a very large part of the world's oceans, and while they're few and far between, species can travel from one place to another, get isolated and speciate, and then make their way back to other reefs. And that's been happening. Coral reefs have been on the planet for 500 million years. That's a long time to accumulate some species.
So is there an optimal depth of water for coral reefs?
So corals grow their fastest immediately underneath the surface.
So the shallower water?
So tropical coral reefs grow in warm, shallow, clear water. Corals do their best growth in 30 feet or less, where they've got lots of sunlight. Sunlight filters out of the water the deeper you get, and they can only grow up to the surface of the water and not beyond. You'll see in some coral reefs that at low tide, the corals will be sticking out. That's about as high up as they can get relative to sea level.
So what about the deepest parts, Georgiana Trench and so on? Are there corals there as well?
So you can get deep water coral reefs, and you can get those in cold water as well. Functionally, they're different from the ones I'm talking about, because the reefs that I'm talking about are built by corals. Deep water reefs are rocky reefs that have corals on them. But corals, in addition to this really amazing thing I talked about where they grow plants in their body to get a lot of their energy, they do that when they're in shallow water and have access to lots of sunlight. They can also act as pretty formidable hunters. They sting animals that pass them by and then can eat them. So corals can live in very low light environments. They just won't grow as fast.
So you showed a chart that showed 1% temperature change in water temperature. In the last ice age, how much colder was the water then? And how were the corals doing?
So whenever the environment changes in a big way, it upsets coral reefs. At the end of the last ice age, I don't know the exact
We
temperature
want to say
changes.
10,000 years ago?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But the distribution of coral reefs really changed at that time because when at the end of the ice age, what happened was the sea levels got higher because the polar ice caps melted. And the healthiest coral reefs were able to keep growing with the surface of the water as it went up. Some reefs couldn't make it. They couldn't grow fast enough. And they actually got effectively drowned. So there are some places where you've got sort of deeper water reefs that are not at the surface because the corals weren't able to grow fast enough. The thing about an ice age shift that's different from what we're seeing today, though, is that ice age shifts are slower than the climate change we're seeing right now. Even if it happens over 500 or 1,000 years, that's a lot different than happening over 20 years from the perspective of the corals. And they also didn't come with all these other threats around things like pollution and overfishing. So corals have made it through hundreds and hundreds of ice ages, and they've been just fine.
So as some of our older members know, 10,000 years ago, this was a big valley, and the coastline was out at the Fairlawns. So are there coral reefs in the bay now, and what was happening before they were there, when we were just a big valley here? How do they start forming here?
So coral reefs, the kind that I'm talking about that build the reef, are in the tropics. They're not here. There are corals that live in coastal California. I wouldn't call them coral reefs in the same way. The reef building corals live where the water is warmer than this. In fact, it's interesting because if you look at before people started affecting reefs, the limitation to where you would find reefs was cold water, not warm water. They're facing a lot of problems because the water's getting too warm for them, but historically it's been cold water that's been the problem for coral reefs.
So when we eat a clam, what we're eating is the food inside of the protective shell around the clam. The clam had to invent that shell around it. Am I right in understanding that coral reefs are these deposits of kind of cover that the coral itself creates, and that the coral is this little animal that lives inside this shell-like structure that it generates?
Close.
Okay.
Corals
I'm never really right. I've got to get close. I'm happy to be just close.
Corals don't build a shell. They build a skeleton underneath them. And if you were to touch a coral, which you should not do, if you were to touch a coral, you would find it smooth and soft. And so you wouldn't feel a shell if you touched a living coral.
If you
would
touch
feel
the
soft
animal
body.
that's there, it would be smooth
The
and
surface
soft.
would be like the inside of the clam, not the outside of the clam. The hard part is underneath that. They do not build that same kind of protective shell. But clams are a really good example because in some coral reefs, clams are actually very important reef builders just like the corals. And if you look at the structures that are built underneath, things like giant clams in the Pacific also build calcium carbonate shells, which are part of the reef.
So when we see a clam this big, how old is a clam, typical clam that's, an inch and a half across?
I mean, there's many, many different species of clams out there, and I'm
Minimally-
not an expert, but a lot of
then-
clams will grow pretty quickly.
So the question is then on a coral, when we touch a piece of coral, we won't touch it, but when we observe a piece of coral, how young how soon after the coral lands does it start to have this crustacean-like, structure around it?
So when that baby coral floats away and lands onto its reef, probably wouldn't see it if you were looking on the reef. If you had like a magnifying glass, you might be able to find it. It's really, really small. And when it arrives, it actually arrived looking like a jellyfish, and then it landed on the bottom, and it glued its head to the bottom, and now it's a polyp. And once it does that, it's just one little tiny polyp. It hasn't built any skeleton yet. It would look like an anemone, a tiny baby anemone. And so if you know where to look and you've got a magnifying glass, you could probably find them on the reef. But people don't usually start noticing them until they're like, the size of a quarter or something like that. And for a lot of corals, that'll be like a year or two after they settle. And what they've done in that time is they found a place to live. They've started a colony of little plants in their tissues. They've started stinging little animals going by. They started getting some food, and then they can start to grow. When they get big enough, they actually split into two. They bud a new coral polyp next to it, and that's how the colony grows. And now you'd have two little anemone-looking things next to each other. And when they grow, they can split, and then you have four little anemone-looking things. And if they keep growing, you're going to get this exponential growth, 16 and so forth. And what happens is that once it's up to 50 or so little anemones, that might be the time when you can start to see 50 little polyps because it's a larger structure. And you might see a little mound of calcium carbonate. But there are corals that you can go to in places in the world, and they're bigger than four of these tables together, and from the ceiling all to the roof, and they're growing this giant boulder. That animal, that colony, is probably at minimum hundreds, probably thousands of years old. And so corals can keep living indefinitely because they can keep dividing and splitting into new clones of themselves. So there's no lifespan for corals. They can live theoretically forever.
So the coral that started this little colony that you've described that may be hundreds or potentially thousands of years old, that living creature, that same living creature is still alive, or its grandchildren are what we're looking at?
I think that's a philosophical question because that animal divided into two, and then that one divided into two, and that one divided into two. So which one is it? I don't know anymore. It's all of them.
It always gets back down to sex, doesn't it? How can you tell, are there male and female corals? Speaking of sex, I know we'll stay on this subject.
There's both. There are corals that have distinct males and females, and there are corals that can be both male and female at the same time.
How can we, this is a question, especially in San Francisco, how can we tell them apart?
The easiest way is to wait until they spawn.
Wait until they spawn. With so much of the life on Earth. Or can we invite them to the stag cruise? Someone's asking. Okay. What are optimal water temperatures for corals? Is there such a thing? What are optimal?
So every coral reef around the world lives in a place where there is a background set of environmental conditions. And so if you look at a place like Hawaii, Hawaii is relatively cold for coral reefs, and the ideal temperature for corals in Hawaii is relatively cold. If you go to the Red Sea is particularly warm for coral reefs, and the ideal temperature for coral reefs there is going to be a lot warmer. Usually in the 70s and 80s Fahrenheit are the temperatures where they survive, up into the 90s. But the difference between one region and another is going to be important. So if you took a Hawaiian coral and moved it to the Red Sea, it would be in terrible shape.
Welcome again to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from St. Francis Yacht Club. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Webster, Executive Director of the Coral Reef Alliance. And we'll take some questions from the audience now. Staff Commodore Bruce Monroe, sir, question.
Thank you, Ron. Corals, as you say, are animals. Do they, like other animals, take in oxygen and give off CO2?
Absolutely. The little plants that live inside them do the opposite. They take in CO2 and give off oxygen.
What happens to a coral when someone steps on it or a boat keel runs into it?
So that structure on the outside is soft, which means that getting hit by something hard is going to tear those tissues and kill a portion of that animal. So if you stand on a coral, the place where you put your weight on that coral is at a minimum going to hurt those animals a lot, but has the potential to kill them. Certainly a keel of a boat hitting a reef is going to kill those coral animals where it runs into them.
So the little coral that's inside the hard, crusty surface, that coral gets killed, it gets damaged, it gets broken. What happens to it?
So if you've got a coral, so the coral is a soft material on the top.
Right.
If that gets, like blunt force trauma, it's just going to kill it. You can break corals. So a lot of corals are very fragile tree-like structures. And if you shatter those tree-like structures, individual pieces of it can actually grow their own colony. In fact, that's what some people do when they're doing coral reef restoration, is they'll take a coral like that and they'll break it into little pieces and then try and start many colonies with the little pieces. Now, it's a smaller colony then, so you're essentially taking something that was big and turning it into something small and starting over with it. But the corals can handle that.
So like a worm, you can break pieces of it apart and it'll regenerate?
Yeah. But I would not say like a worm. I would say more like a tree where you would take a cutting and you could grow a new one off. But the coral is a colony. Every single one of those animals in the colony can conceivably live on its own. So every polyp has the capability of living on its own and starting its own colony. So you could theoretically take it down to the single colony level. You just have a very hard time doing it without damaging the colony. And they do actually have like a plumbing network underneath the colony where they share resources. So it would cause harm to the animal for sure to do that. The other problem with breaking a piece off is that it's not then glued to the bottom, and in a wave, in a storm, it can just get washed away. So there's a period of time after a coral fragments before it has an opportunity to actually glue itself to the bottom and begin to grow.
Dan Kiriko has a question.
Yes, Dr. Webster. You mentioned overfishing as a problem for the reefs, and it implies an independence or symbiotic relationship. How is that? What is that relationship about, and what can be done, well, obviously, about that problem as well?
So the coral reef is a place where there's fierce competition for space. There's not much coral reef habitat out there, and there's thousands and thousands of species, and they're all trying to get a piece of space and grow there. It's kind of probably like the real estate market in San Francisco. And what's happening is that the corals that can hold space can grow and become a big colony. One of the things that fishes do on the reef is there's a whole group of herbivorous fishes. You can think of it as like sheep on the reef. And what they do is they're scraping things like seaweeds off the bottom, and they're eating them. When you take those fish off the reef, what you do is you remove the cleaning service. And so now those spaces on the bottom, the seaweeds can find a place to live, and there's nothing to eat them. Especially if you're dumping Miracle-Gro through pollution into that system, suddenly you've created an environment where the seaweeds can grow and take over, and there's nothing to keep them in check. Then it becomes a competition for space problem. It's actually worse than that because the seaweeds produce chemicals in the water that are actually harmful to the corals, so they can actually help starting to kill the corals as well.
So, Dr. Webster, it's been completely fascinating listening to you talk about your life study and coral reefs. If somebody wants to help, how can they help the Coral Reef Alliance? And we find it under coralreefalliance.org?
Yeah, so we're coral.org, coral.org. Yeah, if you want to learn more about us, if you want to make a donation, if you want to do anything like that, that's a great place to go. There are a few of us in the room, so we're happy to chat afterward as well. I'm happy to chat with you. Dory Gaines, our development director, is here. She's happy to chat as well. And we've got our current board member, Jim Lucier, and we can test Medea and see what she still knows.
So each time we have a speaker, there's always some genesis. And in this particular case, you've just mentioned the person who suggested this in the first place. He's our member. Happy to say our St. Francis Yacht Club member, Jim Lucier. Thank you so much, Jim, for making the suggestion that we have Dr. Webster as a speaker. Thank you very much, Michael. It's been great speaking with you. Thank you very much from the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Meeting is adjourned.